Just waiting here for the slides to.
Hang on, I got a weird window in here.
Evening, everybody. Nice to see you all. Thanks for coming to our session. Our techno wizard, Linda, is pulling up our slides. There they are.
Oh, okay. Welcome, and thanks for joining us to talk about mapping our characters' journeys to self-discovery. We're excited to talk to you tonight about 3 key areas related to this topic: exploring your character writing strategies, developing character arcs and how they overlap with plot, theme, setting, and other characters, and how best to tap into real life to create engaging fiction. We hope to provide an informative and fun session for everyone, but before we get started, we'd like to briefly introduce ourselves. Linda, how about if you go first?
All right, I'm Linda Ulisite. I'm a founding member of Paper Lantern Writers, a marketing collective for historical fiction authors, as well as admin on their Facebook group, Shine with Paper Lantern Writers. I'm also marketing director for Women Writing the West and an active member of Historical Novel Society, Women Fiction Writers Association, and Hawaii Writers Guild. I live in San Jose, California. I was born and raised in the area and have never lived more than 25 miles from there. I have an MFA in creative writing from Lindenwood University, and I've written 2 historical women's novels, Under the Almond Trees and The Aloha Spirit. The Aloha Spirit just won a bronze medal at the Independent Publisher Book Awards and a grand prize at the Chanticleer International Book Awards. I have a spoiled yellow Labrador who appears often on my Instagram, as well as a husband, 2 adult sons, and a daughter-in-law who's expecting our first grandchild in October.
Hey, thanks, Linda. Marion, I'd love to hear about your background.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for gathering with us to talk about writing fiction. I'm Marion O'Shea Wernicke, and I co-edited and contributed to a collection of short fiction and memoir called Confessions, Fact or Fiction. I also wrote a memoir about my father called Tom O'Shea, a 20th Century Man. And my first novel came out in September of 2020. The title is Toward That Which is Beautiful, published by She Writes Press. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. I grew up in a large Irish Catholic family, the oldest of 7 children. When I was in high school, before I finished, I entered the convent of the Teaching Order of Sisters that I had been taught by, and I remained in the convent for 11 years. During that time, I volunteered to go to South America, to Lima, and I worked in a large urban parish there. After my time in Lima, I left the convent because I realized I wanted to be married and have children. Later, a couple of years later, I met a nice, handsome engineer named Mike Wernicke, and we were married and went to Madrid the first year of our marriage, where we both were working. And then we came home and had 3 children. And today we live in Austin, Texas, near our only grandson. So thank you for coming.
Okay, Mary, over to you. How long have you been writing?
Hi, y'all. I'm Mary Helen Sheriff, and I've been writing as long as I can remember, but I started thinking of it as maybe a professional idea when I was in graduate school for teaching. And it's the first part of this journey. I ended up going to Hollins University, and oh, I see my face wasn't on. Thanks for letting me know. All right. Anyway, I ended up going to Hollins University and got an MFA in children's literature. Boop and Eve's Road Trip is actually the 4th book I've written, but it's the first one that's published. The others are for middle grade and YA readers, and they sit on my computer. I've taken dozens of writing classes, attended conferences, read craft books, even taught college English for a few years. I've also taught elementary school and middle school and in professional settings. My novel, Boop and Eve's Road Trip, has won the American Fiction Award in the category of coming to age and was a finalist for the 2021 Eric Hoffer Award and the Montaigne Award. I'm one of the founders of Bookish Road Trip, which is a Facebook group for people who love to read and travel. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and that's pretty much me. Sally, I'd love to hear about your background too.
Okay, Thanks, Mary. Again, I'm Sally Kolmish. I'm author of The Best Part of Us. I've worked as a writer throughout my career, first as a journalist at several newspapers throughout the United States and Canada, where I focused on environmental issues and their impact on human health. I switched fully into the environmental policy and communications arena after going back for a master's degree and focused on how to develop policies and programs that in particular protect wastewater, our essential connections with nature. I took the big leap into fiction in 2012 to try a new avenue to help readers consider their connections with nature, family, and place. The Best Part of Us is my first novel. It was released last September, and I'm thrilled that it was honored as a finalist for the Story Circle Network's Sarton Award for Contemporary Fiction, and also won 2 finalist awards for the National Indie Excellence Awards, as well as the Jurors' Choice Prize. And I live in the Great Lakes state of Michigan with my husband and son. So next I'll turn it over to Linda, who will introduce our first section, which is Prewriting Strategies for Character Exploration.
Thanks, Sally. There are a lot of ways elements to consider. Today, we're going to speak specifically about characters. I recommend first planning the protagonist's story arc, then maybe a secondary character or two, and even the antagonist, depending on the needs of your book. Each of us will speak to a particular pre-writing strategy. You can choose the one that works for you or combine them, but you do not need to do all 4 methods for each character. Every author knows that novels require research. I'm going to talk specifically about researching to develop characters. My books are novelized accounts of my ancestors. Once I am intrigued by a detail of someone's life, I start by interviewing family. I admired my husband's grandmother and wanted to tell her story of growing up in Honolulu and coming to California after the Pearl Harbor attack. I interviewed her 3 daughters and her second husband. That gave me some events in her life, but there were lots of gaps. That meant my story would be more fiction than biography. I researched historical events to develop character attitudes and emotions. For example, I had to look hard to find civilian reflections on the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when most easily available writing was from the perspective of the military personnel or the plantation owners. I also researched period details for Hawaii. I had to find out which hotels were in Waikiki at the time and imagine the view from Punch Bowl to the harbor. I also found out about telephone and water service, attitude toward the differing ethnicities represented in Honolulu, foods, and clothing. All this gave me setting and daily life details for my character. It also provided information to build a character profile, like the one Marion's going to tell you about now.
Before I began my novel, I knew my central character was this young woman who entered the convent. So I wrote out a complete character profile of Kate, her name is, our Sister Mary Catherine, her family, her upbringing in the Midwest, her personality, that she was a warm, engaging young girl, liked to date, liked boys. But today when I was walking, I remembered that in my first draft of the novel, I also included a long chapter about her parents and went into great detail about their histories. Well, needless to say, that chapter got thrown out, but it was very important that I wrote that because it really helped me to situate this character in a certain time and place. At an early age in the novel, Kate decides to go to the convent. So then I had to give the background of her time in the convent, her formation, her feelings of homesickness, all of these things. The second main character is the priest that she falls in love with, Tom Lynch. And I have to say, I did not write out a profile of him, but I had a picture of him in my mind looking somewhat like the Irish actor Colin Farrell. And then as I wrote the chapter where they're talking, I filled in his biography. So Mary, how did you develop you had 2 main characters. So would you tell us about the pre-writing stage?
Sure. So I used the journal method. I had a list of prompts from a book called The 90-Day Novel. I did not write my book in 90 days, just to clarify. It took me 6 years. So I don't know if I recommend it for a method that really works to write your novel in 90 days. However, the journal prompts in it are fabulous. And I have a few on the screen here that you can see. And at the end of this presentation, we're going to give you our email addresses. We have a whole handout that goes with this presentation, and there's a page in it full of journal prompts that you can use for character building. So stay tuned if that sounds like something you might be interested in getting a copy of. But the prompts included things like my favorite holiday memory and my biggest regret. If I won the lottery, I'd. And each day I spent an hour answering those journal prompts as if I was the character. So first person point of view from the character. I choose one of the characters in the book and answer the questions. I did about 20 minutes for each prompt, although if I was going strong, I'd let myself go longer. And I usually did about 3 prompts a day. I did it for the main characters. So I had dual protagonists. I did it for both of them a lot. And then I did it for the secondary characters as well. But not as much. And I did it for about a month before I actually started writing the book.
Wow.
And Mary, I wondered, did you keep journaling until you felt that you knew the characters well enough to write the story? So how did you know you captured all that you?
Okay, your audio went in and out a little bit, but I think what you asked is, how did I know when to stop?
Yes.
Yes, okay. That's a great question. For me, I think it's like a gut feeling. I got to a point with a character where I would start a new prompt and I wouldn't learn anything new.
Mhm.
And once that happened once or twice, I kind of felt like I had this character, at least for now. And I could always go back to it later if later on in the process I found out there were things I didn't know, or one of the characters was weaker than I wanted them to be. And I think I spent about 30 hours by the time I cycled through the 5 characters that I did it with. And by then I was so itching to write. I couldn't stand the thought of having to do any more pre-writing. And that was when I knew I was ready.
Okay, great. Does everybody hear me now? Can you guys all hear?
Yes, that's good.
All right, thanks. I'll lean in a little bit. Because the characters and plot in The Best Part of Us are entirely fictional, my research, unlike Linda's, where she researched her historical background of her family, mine focused really more on the time, the setting, and plot rather than the characters. I did complete biographies like Marion did, and I did also do journal prompts for each of my 5 primary characters, probably because this is my first novel. Had to try new things, right? And the last step I did was a free writing exercise, which I learned in my creative writing program, that for me brought the characters most to life. The challenge is to allow yourself to have the characters speak through you rather than from you, based on all you've learned in these previous exercises. To do this, you need to find a quiet spot and free write a letter from each character to you that starts with, "There's something you don't know about me." Now, the challenge with this really is that you need to not stop writing. Just let it flow. Don't worry about spelling or tense, whether you have complete sentences, whether it makes sense or not. Because often what most people that do this find is that different unacceptable or surprising emotions and feelings might emerge, which might be the key to discovering all sorts of new things about your characters and lead your story in exciting and new directions. And I still remember the really odd sensation of doing this. I sat in my local library for 11 hours and let the letters just spill out onto my computer screen. I'm sure people around me thought I was very weird because most of the time my eyes were closed. But I have to say that Best Letter was the only one that I knew exactly what it meant. The other 4 characters, I didn't have a clue what they were saying or why. It just didn't make sense. But feeling the characters coming alive through those words was kind of magical and fun. So I kept trying it while I was writing the story itself. And I focused on listening to the characters as I started a new scene rather than trying to control the narrative. And I found that they and the story kept deepening until I got to the novel's 10th draft and finally could understand how all of their individual stories wove together and could keep going to create something that I really enjoyed. At that point, I read the letters again, and I was amazed that I now understood all 5 letters and that the story itself had become true to each character's original message in those letters. So kind of a fun experiment. Hopefully one of these strategies will help you to learn everything you need to know about your characters to write their story. So we're going to move on to our next section, which focuses on developing character arcs. And Mary's going to start us off.
Sure. Thanks so much. I love hearing about a journey of a novel and how you learn so much through the process of actually writing it. What I have here is something that's from K.M. Weiland, and she calls it a truth chart. And basically, when I wrote Boop and Eve's Road Trip, I'll be perfectly frank, I did not do this beforehand. I'm writing a new novel now. I'm doing it as pre-writing strategy this time. But it turned out that through the process of writing Boop and Eve's Road Trip, I answered all of these questions, and I thought to myself, goodness, if I had known all this when I started, I could have saved myself a draft or two, I think. And so I'm giving it a try this time on the front end instead of the back end. But going through, here are some things that you work to figure out. Character-specific truth. This is the thing that the character needs to learn in order to be a whole person. And the specific lie then is the thing that they believe that's wrong, that's keeping them from their truth. The thing the character wants, that's their motivation, that's obvious. The thing the character needs, it could be the same thing they want, but often it's not. And this is the thing the character needs in order to find their truth. The character's backstory ghost, K.M. Weiland suggests coming up with 3 scenes that happen before the novel starts, which are things that make the character believe the lie and show the character's need for this truth. The character's virtue, this is the thing that is good about the character that's going to make us like the character at least a little bit. And then the character's flaw. Which is the thing that the character does that maybe isn't great. The interesting thing about a flaw, though, is sometimes flaws get twisted in the arc of a story, and they end up being the thing that saves them. So that can always be an interesting journey for a character too, to learn to accept their flaws or overcome them. So that's the idea. And then on the next screen, you're going to see example from my book. So again, I had 2 dual protagonists. They each had to have all of these things, and they do. I'm not going to read you this whole screen. You're capable of reading it yourself if you want to, but I did want to talk through the truth and lie scenario because I think that's really the key part. I mean, it's called a truth chart for a reason. And so looking at Eve, her truth is that she can only find happiness if she pursues the life she wants. That's what she needs to learn in the novel. What she believes at the start of the novel is that her mother knows best. And so what that means is the novel starts with Eve living the life her mother thinks she should be living, not the life she wants to live. And it's going to take the whole novel for her to figure out how to stand up to her mom and do exactly what she should do in order to find her own life and her own happiness. Boop, on the other hand, needs to learn that she can't find home without healing for her family without sharing the truth. And so she doesn't think that but the lie that she believes is that her secret's going to make everything worse. And she's sort of in denial at the situation her family is in, thinking things aren't that bad. So she will quickly be reminded that, made aware that things are bad. And she's going to have to learn to risk sharing her secret in order for her family to heal and for her to be able to find a place to call home again. When I started the novel, the original plot line, I only had I thought Eve was going to be the main character. And it was going to be her emotional journey from depression to self-actualization. I made a note card for each scene. I had a brief summary of what would happen and how that would affect each character. But it was only when I started writing the book that I realized that Boop wasn't just the mentor along in the passenger seat, and her character took on a life of its own. So I had to go through and do the very same things I did for Eve, for Boop, in terms of figuring out her plot and her backstory and weaving those things together. Note that not all characters in novels are going to find their truth.
Right.
So sometimes, for example, a villain is probably going to get stuck in the lie and is going to end even more firmly rooted in that lie. So while the journey is to find the truth, not all characters are going to be successful in that. And I think that's an important thing. And even within it may be your main character who doesn't find the truth. I mean, that would be more of a tragedy, I suppose. But
Right.
so it's kind of a neat way to look at character arcs. Linda, I'm wondering about your character and how it relates to like theme and plot. So I've kind of talked about the two characters and how to mesh those two, but what about you when you're trying to put all the elements of fiction together?
Well, first of all, Mary, I don't think you've ever told anybody that Boop is Eve's grandmother.
Oh,
that gives a whole different feel. All right, so theme and plot. I have a lot of ideas on this, of course. In the Aloha spirit, the change in my character during the course of the book is the theme as well as the character arc. Dolores, my character, discovers the Aloha spirit in herself as she works her way through the plot. Other characters reflect the theme to help the main character develop her understanding and growth. Each of Dolores's mentors gives her a piece of the puzzle. From Noelani, she learns that Aloha means hard work. From her friend Rachel, she learns Aloha means family love. From Manolo, she learns Aloha is the joyous sharing of life's energy. From Ruth, she learns Aloha means learning to love when it's difficult. Dolores realizes she must embrace the whole of the Aloha spirit in order to model it for her daughters. Marian, how does the nun in your book make her journey to self-discovery?
Well, the important thing in my novel is it is not told in chronological order. So the novel begins at a low point in my main character's life when she's very confused. She's overcome by the climate she's in, by the lack of her ability to speak the language of the indigenous people, and above all, by her terrible attraction to this Irish priest with whom she is working. So it begins with her leaving. We don't know why at the first part of the novel. And she walks out of the convent with no money and no destination. So then it follows her for those 8 days. But I had to fill in the background, the attraction to the priest. I had to create scene after scene after scene, and even farther back to why she ever wanted to become a nun in the first place. So it's sort of retracing her early lack of self-knowledge until finally, by the end of her journey, she comes to a realization of what she should actually be doing and who she really, more importantly, who she really is. So that's when she begins to accept her true self. So Sally has the most beautiful setting in her novel, and I wondered how she builds the arc of her character's journey to self-knowledge in using her setting.
Great, thanks, Susan. Like Miriam's novel, the best part of us also begins in the present tense, and in a key inciting incident when main character Beth receives a letter from her beloved grandfather asking her to return to the island where she and her family spent their summers in her childhood. To understand why this is so shocking to Beth, we have to return to the past to learn about her and her family's experiences on that island. including each character's arc and their own truth, lies, wants, and needs, as Mary outlined. Then we can finally come back to the present and discover how Beth deals with her grandfather's request. So key to each character arc in this story is the setting, the island and the lake, which actually becomes a character almost in its own right because of how each character acts and interacts with nature and with each other when they're there, the choices they make because of the value or lack of value they place on that setting, and how nature's actions itself impact their lives and decisions. So in this way, nature is essential to the themes and messages, as well as each character's arc. So in our last section, Marion's going to lead us off with a talk about how we can tap into real life to write fiction.
Writers are people that pay close attention to the world around them. And in three areas, really, that we need to look at are characters based on people we know, the physical setting, and our own life experiences. And our challenge as writers is to make this world of our novels so realistic, so vivid, that the reader is immersed in that, feels as if he or she is going on the journey with our characters. So in thinking about setting, as Sally was just talking about, we have to think about the setting in time, whether it's a contemporary setting or a historical setting. If it's historical, how do we get those concrete details? We have to look at pictures, paintings, films, costume, museums, things like that, in order to feel realistic. And as far as the physical setting, many of us have gone to the places that we write about, or certainly have gotten out maps to be sure we're very clear about our physical setting. For my novel, it was set in Latin America, part of it, most of it. And I actually did travel to all the places that she visits in the novel, except for one place. And I had to do some pretty deeper research on that particular place. But I had to get her from the Altiplano down to Lima in 8 days. So that was the constraint of my setting. As far as our own life experiences, that is really the magical part of writing fiction. How do we work in our own life without it being autobiographical? Because people tend to think you are your main character very often. That's one of the big questions you get. Were you the character in the novel? Not exactly. So, of course, I had lived in Peru for 3 years. I had traveled. And I found some of the minor characters, that my two main characters were not real people. They were imaginary. But I found as I was writing the people she met along the way, the minor characters, they were often kind of a composite of people that I actually did know.
And so Marion, you really found that this story ended up being a true combination of real life and fiction for you.
Right. It's the story of a young woman who thinks that what she should be is a nun, and she has vowed this life, but she's still in temporary vows, so she still has an out. It's in the early 60s. This is a picture on the slide of Lake Titicaca, which is where the novel begins. When she walks out, she walks along the side of this lake. She spends 8 days on the run, meeting both dangerous and kind people, but also reflecting, doing these flashbacks to her life before, the attraction to this priest. And by the end of the novel, she has to make a decision about her journey and about her own truth. So it isn't my story, but I could, of course, use a lot of my own experiences. For example, the early formation in the convent. That was the easiest part for me to write, because it was just straight remembering what it was like to go to the convent when you're young, how homesick you felt, how you were trying to tamp down this loneliness and kind of focus yourself on what you were supposed to be doing. So I did also leave the convent, but I didn't run away. I certainly wouldn't have been courageous enough to go 8 days with no money in Peru and get on buses and hitch rides and steal a guy's jacket and all the things that she does in here. But after 11 years in the convent, I did make that decision to leave. And I'll tell you, it was a very hard decision. It took me 3 years to decide that I was free to do this, that I didn't want to feel guilty. So that was, I can understand very much how she felt. Mary, I would be very interested to hear about your experiences, because I kept thinking of you as your main character when I was reading your novel.
I'm not sure that's a good thing. Yeah, so as Linda, mentioned, it might help if I backstep a few times and actually explain sort of the summary of my book and give you a little bit of context. So Boop and Eve's Road Trip is a story of a college freshman named Eve. She goes on a road trip with her spunky grandma, Boop, through the American South looking for a missing relative. Along the way, Boop helps Eve to find her future, and Eve helps Boop to release her past. It's a coming of age women's fiction book. Book clubs have really enjoyed some of the themes of the novel and talking about those, like depression and forgiveness and family and intergenerational conflict and that sort of thing. So anyway, to answer your real question, which is how does that influence my real life? It is fiction. But Boop is loosely based on my grandmother, who you can see in the top right. Her name is Hootie, or that's what we called her. Her name was really Mary, just like mine, but we called her Hootie. And like Boop, she grew up in a small town in Virginia. She collected birdhouses. She loved to garden. She called her car the Gray Ghost. She clipped recipes from Southern living that she never cooked. And she had all these little idiosyncrasies, and I just, put them all into the character of Boop. My grandma passed away when I was pregnant with my first child, and I started writing this just a couple years after that. And I think that I was still missing her, and I think that comes through in the novel. My grandma had a difficult life, and she'd made some significant mistakes, particularly in parenting my mom and her sisters. But the lady that I knew by the time I came along had reinvented herself and was this amazing, loving grandmother. And that's who Boop is. Boop is a lady who has a past, she's made mistakes, but she's kind of found her feet, and she wants to help Eve do the same thing. As for Eve, it's funny that you pictured me, but so the big connection between myself and Eve, which is real, is that Eve was struggling with depression, and I, as I started writing this, had just gone through a bout of postpartum depression. So not exactly the same thing that a college freshman's facing, but many of the same feelings. And I think that part of my healing process was writing this book and attempting to capture what it's like to sit in a dark place and to feel like you hadn't earned the right to sit there. I think as a society, we can be pretty empathetic when depression meets grief and trauma, but we're bewildered when people are depressed and they can't explain why. And so that's sort of what I was trying to capture with Eve, to give a voice to that experience. And Eve was born from my journey from depression to recovery. Some other things that are related to real life, like Boop and Eve in the novel, Hootie and I used to daydream about renting an RV when I turned 16 and taking a road trip across the country. For many reasons, this road trip never happened in real life. Among those, neither of us was capable of driving an RV across the country. But also my grandma had bad arthritis by then and would have been very uncomfortable by such a journey. And so Boop and Eve's road trip was sort of a way for me to imagine a road trip that never was. The picture on the left is from a setting that's in the book. One of the places they stop is the Fountain of Youth in St. Augustine, Florida. I originally wrote this scene just using the park's website and random pictures that visitors had placed online. But later it turned out I was able to stop there on my trip somewhere else and check it out in real life. But it was interesting because I didn't really change much about the scene after seeing it in real life. And so it sort of made me feel good about the quality of research you can do on the internet. But I did change a couple of details that gave it some more texture, or I added some details. From the internet, I knew there were peacocks there. I didn't realize how many peacocks there were, nor how like loose they were. They were like running rampant everywhere. I also didn't know that they were noisy, which I found interesting. So I had them more rampant and more making noises and things like that. Another detail that I added were the squirrels there were like super aggressive. They were not the least bit afraid of human beings, would get way close, like come and take things right next to you. And it was just startling. But it's interesting because I had readers who read it, and one woman who had not been to this place who was like, what was the meaning of the aggressive squirrels? Like, was it symbolic of something? And I was like, no, they just are there. And then on the other hand, I had a friend who had been there, and she was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you mentioned the squirrels. How weird was that? And so it's just kind of funny how you can get carried away in writing with symbolism and reality and that sort of thing. So the final picture you see on the page is a mailbox. It says Kindred Spirit on it. It's a little fuzzy. I'm not sure you can see it, but it's on Bird Isle in North Carolina, and it used to be its own little barrier island, and it is a bird preserve. And there's an island right next to it where I vacation every summer called Sunset Beach, and it used to be that you could only go to Bird Isle during low tide, because otherwise you'd have to swim, and it was a little far to swim. But over the years, hurricanes have come and erosion has happened and whatever, but now it's one big long island. But the end that has the mailbox is literally just like the picture. I mean, on the other behind me where I took this picture is the ocean. And the mailbox is real, and inside are a bunch of journals and pens, and there's a bench there, and that's pretty much it. And you can sit down and write a note to the kindred spirit and sort of release your thoughts and worries and concerns to the universe. Which is a neat and freeing experience. And it's also really cool to read what other people have put in the mailbox. The mailbox has been there for decades. Somebody must go and take the journals out and put new ones in, but who that is a mystery. So anyway, those are two of the places they stopped on their journey. Linda, I'm wondering about you and your novel. What in real life influenced your book?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I would like to put that mailbox on Bird Island in my next book. I got a child, that's pretty cool. But the most important influence in my own books are the real people who inspired them. My husband's grandmother was the inspiration for the character in the Aloha Spirit. You can see her there with her husband leaving for the World Fair in San Francisco, and a picture of her in front of the plantation house where she grew up. But Under the Almond Trees, my other book, is about three of my ancestors in Pioneer, California, taken from stories that my grandmother told me about a suffragette, a female architect, and an ancestor that had her own photography business. I gathered stories about the people, but an author's real life experiences give the characters emotions that drive your plot, especially if you're writing about real people and you don't have a whole lot of that type of background information. So in Under the Almond Trees, I included a story about my own young son trying to save a fish that was dropped, that a bird dropped on the Santa Cruz Pier. So he ran up and grabbed it and threw it over the railing into the ocean, only to have it be snatched by another fish. So that was a great scene to be put in by my character's son. When I was planning for the Aloha Spirit, my mother-in-law told me that as a child during the Pearl Harbor attack, she was confused when the Japanese neighborhood near them was bombed. Why was the enemy bombing their own people? Based on this, I created a Japanese family as neighbors so I could show their interaction with my main Portuguese family by bringing over food, sharing a tradition over a new birth, and reacting to the attack itself. Familiar settings near me in California, in Santa Cruz and Pacific Grove, enabled me to write setting details for Under the Almond Trees that put my readers right there with my characters. Frequent traveling to Hawaii did the same for the Aloha Spirit. Even if you've never been there, you can find the spirit of aloha in Hawaii's fresh ocean air, the flowers, the trade winds, the natural beauty that smooths the struggles of daily life. Sally's novel, I know, is also deeply grounded in nature. Go ahead and tell us about that, Sally.
Great. Thanks, Peter. So the best part of us tells the story of Beth, as I've already said, and her family summers on a pristine Canadian lake, where they revel in the sweet smell of dew on early morning hikes. They enjoy the loon's evening trills across the lake's many bays. And they enjoy an unshakable bond with each other, with friends and nature on their island of granite and pines. When that bond is threatened and then torn apart, first as her family's rights are threatened to the island, and then by nature itself, Beth creates a new life in Chicago with a solid barrier between her past and her present. When her grandfather asks her to return to the island to determine its fate, she must decide whether she will risk everything to determine if what was lost still remains. So because nature is such a central character in this novel, I chose a setting I know deep in my heart to ground the story. And I think I've learned in enough of my novel writing courses and programs that it's helpful to actually ground something, whether it's the setting or the characters or the plot, in something that you're very familiar with if you haven't experienced directly, because that helps you, again, to ground the story and give you a basis to work from. So this particular place, and you can see all the pictures, are of a place that I can see, I can hear, I can smell and touch every time I close my eyes. And this is actually the lake that I grew up and spent my summers on, in a log cabin that my grandfather hand built. When I started writing the story, I started writing it as if my island was Beth's island. And by the end of it, her island had moved across the lake, was much bigger, and she had a fort on the top that she built every year that I had never had. So I think a lot of the story, the characters, the plot are truly fiction, but it was kind of my fun way to actually experience some things on this lake that I had never done, like build a fort or go loon diving and some of the other things that she does. So it was much easier for me to bring this setting alive for the reader versus if I had chosen a place that I don't know as well. And so I created these characters first and foremost based on their relationship to this place, to this lake and island. To explore, it was a way to explore the essential roles that nature and family and place hold in all of our lives, and the theme of where and what loyalties we have. By doing so, I hope readers will consider their own ties to places in nature that they love, and recognize that we are all as much a part of the natural world as every tree, every plant, every soaring bird, and even the spider on our windowsills, at least on my kitchen windowsills. And once we recognize this and the importance of being loyal to who and what is true in our own lives, we find the best part of ourselves. And so this setting was really key to me being able to write this story. So before we close, I want to ask if any of our Linda or Mary or Marian, if you have anything, final thoughts you'd like to share about characters and their journey to self-discovery.
I have one. When Mary was talking about dual protagonists, I kind of ran into the same thing when I was doing Under the Almond Tree. They were all women. And they also was a large block of time, so they were all kind of aging during the story. And I had to do a lot of planning beforehand, a lot of journal writing, a lot of the things that we've talked about in order to make sure they all had very distinct voices. So that was an important thing.
I would just talk to the people that are listening today or watching us. You can see from all of us, we have very different approaches to writing. And I think that's really important. There's no formula for fiction. You're bringing yourself, your experiences, your life to this, and there's some kind of magic. And I don't want to get all woohoo, new agey here, but the Greeks and Romans used to invoke the muse, the goddess, to inspire them. And there's something that happens when you're in the flow As long as you've done your research and your homework, it really, especially the first draft, I would say that's where that happens. And then of course, that's the genius of the writer. But then you have to go back, as somebody pointed out, her 10th draft. So that's where your intellect comes in and your critical judgment comes in. We probably could do another discussion sometime on drafts, how many drafts you do and what you do as you revise, because but that first draft to me is the most magical and the most fun. And then comes the hard part of what you're going to throw out. So I hope that people who are watching are encouraged that if they have a story to tell, you too can tell a story.
That's great. Mary, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I just a little note, and in addition to what Marion's saying, not only do different people have different styles and processes, but as I mentioned, this is the 4th book I've written, and I'm writing my 5th, and I haven't done the same process for any of them. Like, and maybe that's just because of how I am, but I like to experiment. I like to try new things. I read a craft book and I think, oh, that sounds neat. I'll do that this time. And so I guess all this to say is there's lots of ways to write a book. So hopefully we've given you a toolbox with some ideas about digging into your characters. But you pick and choose which tools you take out and when you take them out, and you can ignore us entirely if you want. But hopefully we've gotten some good ideas here that have sparked something and maybe gotten your creative juices going.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So as I think Linda told, or Mary told you earlier, we have an information packet that includes worksheets and other things that summarizes everything that we presented here today. So you see our email addresses on the screen. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you'd like to receive that packet, or if you'd like to talk further about mapping your characters' journeys to self-discovery. As everybody said here today, we all have different perspectives and ways that we've done it, or we've done all of them. And I think we all have to find the best one that suits our particular story and our own writing styles. You can also learn more about our novels on our websites or Facebook author pages, and all 4 are available in paperback and ebook, and in some cases an audiobook. I know mine is also an audiobook, and I think Marion, yours is coming out soon, right?
I hope so.
All available, of course, to order or purchase wherever books are sold. So I think that's about all we had to say. Last call, anyone?
Good.
Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you all have a really lovely evening.
Thanks to 1455 for giving us this
Yes.
platform to talk.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the platform.
Thanks.